Welcome to the Broken Frequency Horror Stories channel. Before starting the story, please comment where you are watching from and what time it is. I want you to give this story a chance. Now turn off the lights and get ready to be scared. If you really like the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Some words are immortal, and some words continue to echo even from inside the grave. October 31st, 1926, Detroit, Grace Hospital. The screams and laughter of Halloween echoed outside, but they were not enough to overcome the sterile, gloomy silence of the hospital room. Pale moonlight streamed through the window, hitting the brass bed in the corner, casting shadows over the face of the man lying there. Harry Houdini, a legendary figure who had broken the chains of the world, escaping from icy rivers, locked safes, and every kind of man-made prison. But now, he was about to be defeated by his simplest enemy, an infection spreading from a burst appendix. His wife, Bess, was frozen beside the bed, like a statue, motionless. For years, she had proudly supported him after every performance, but now, she was simply waiting for him to die. Harry's hand grasped Bess's weakly but resolutely, even as he neared his last breath. His will resisted the laws of nature. His fever was high. His consciousness faded in and out. Yet, every word that came out of his mouth was not a testament, but an order for Bess. Our promise, Bess. Don't forget that code. Never, Rosabelle, believe. If I truly return, I will use those words. Then you will know that it's not a medium's trick. This is really me. This was a secret agreement they had made 10 years ago. When Harry's mother died, something changed. Harry had dedicated his life to exposing fake mediums, but a corner of his heart burned with longing for his mother. If there truly was a spiritual life in the afterlife, he had given the key to that door only to Bess, a word, a code. Rosabelle, believe. Bess knew this was their most intimate, most sacred secret. Harry took a deep breath. He fixed his eyes on Bess. If I don't return, Bess, his voice was a little stronger. Then, you will understand that no one returns. Then, all these mediums are fakes. All lies. Bess nodded through her tears. She had sworn to protect her husband's legacy. She would fulfill Harry's last wish. The clock showed 11:30 p.m. The screams of children from outside the hospital. Masks, costumes, laughter. It was all ironic. While Halloween continued to entertain everyone, Harry and Bess were only suffering, according to Celtic belief. Tonight, the veil between the living and the dead would thin, and spirits would be set free. Passage to the world of the living was possible for the dead, and Harry was set to die on this very night. The irony of fate was cruel enough to surprise even an illusionist. Hours later, the redness of pain on Harry's face suddenly turned into an ashen pallor. His eyes opened wide, his irises still glowed with fever, but his gaze was fixed on a dark corner Bess could not see remaining there. For a moment, the expression of pain on his face vanished. In its place, settled a pure, primal terror. Bess had never seen such an expression on Harry's face in her life. This was not the disappointment of failing to break the chains of death, but the horror of falling into a familiar trap. Harry cried out with a weak rattle. No, not an escape. Though his voice was muffled, his words were definite. This was the moment the escape artist understood that he, too, was part of an illusion. Bess, this is a lock. Bess lunged forward in shock. Harry, what do you see? What lock? Harry's hands tried to grasp the emptiness beneath the blanket. The silver ring Bess had gifted him years ago shone on his finger. Those hands seemed to be trying to undo invisible handcuffs and chains. Those hands, which had dedicated their lives to picking locks, were now failing to pick his own destiny. But it was as if the lock had been struck from the outside, not the inside. A look of terror settled in his eyes. Locked. It's locked. Harry spent his last breath on those words. When the clock struck midnight, the ringing church bell echoed in the hospital room. Harry's body went through one last tremor. Then it remained still. The hand Bess held was ice cold. The shadows in the corner of the room suddenly deepened. The candle flame by the bedside flickered for a moment, and then a sharp, metallic click was heard. Bess thought it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew that sound was the closing of a lock. Harry Houdini lost his life on October the 31st, 1926, in the only prison he could not escape. Bess clung to the lifeless body of her beloved husband. Her tears moistened Harry's pale face. That look of terror in Harry's last gaze and his words were the only things gnawing at Bess's mind. The lock. Harry had only said that as he died. Since Houdini was no simple man, this was no simple death. His words must have pointed to a great secret. Bess thought through her sobs. Harry had experienced the thing he feared most throughout his life. He had become the victim of an illusion, held by another power. Houdini's final performance was not an escape, but an irreversible captivity. The next day, while cleaning the hospital room, Bess noticed something shining beneath the bed. It was the key to the rusty iron shackle that Harry used in his favorite escape acts and always carried with him. Normally, Harry would always clean the shackle perfectly, but now there was a light, damp, brown residue on its surface, as if it had been sitting in muddy water for days. Bess picked up the key, thinking of keeping it as a memento of Harry's last moments. As soon as she touched the rusty metal, she realized it was no ordinary key. It was as if the metal was vibrating in her hand, whispering the secret behind closed doors to her. Bess remembered the sound of the lock when her husband died. Could this really be? Perhaps that key was the only way to free Houdini's soul. October 31st, 1927, New York, Houdini House, Bess Houdini. In every one of the 365 days since her husband's death, she had been consumed by thinking of those last words, that last look. This is a lock. Harry's voice was an infinite puzzle echoing in Bess's mind, waiting to be solved. That night, she hadn't given it much credence at the hospital, but with each passing day, she grew more certain that her husband's soul was imprisoned, and that rusty shackle key, bearing a strange damp residue, was tangible evidence of this prison. Bess was now convinced. This key was not just a prop, but the key to the door that locked Harry's spirit. Bess had to remain loyal to Harry's will. Her husband had sworn to expose the fake medium spreading lies. Tonight, Bess would host a seance where mediums claimed to summon spirits. Either Harry would truly return, or the seance would be proven a fake. Harry's study, located on the 3rd floor of the spacious Houdini house, had been converted into a studio and dimly lit. In the middle of the room stood an ornate mahogany table. As Bess arranged the tabletop, she placed Harry's favorite deck of cards, the files he used to expose fake mediums, and that rusty shackle key she kept with faith. The key shone strangely under the candlelight, and the brown residue on it seemed to be slightly vaporizing. Bess sent 2 letters briefly explaining her thoughts and plan to Harry's most trusted friends. A few days later, Arthur Ford, a writer against mediums, and Samuel Baring, Harry's assistant, who had kept his secrets for years, arrived at the Houdini house for the summoning seance. Bess had invited one more person for the seance. She looked at the woman knocking on the door. Madame Lenore, a young medium who was rapidly gaining fame in New York, rumored to be mysterious and powerful. Bess looked into Lenore's eyes. In her gaze, there was neither the cunning of a fraud nor the honest wisdom, only a deep and mysterious air. This made Bess even more tense. When they gathered in the studio, everyone looked at each other with suspicion and nervousness. Harry's friends approached Lenore skeptically, but they trusted Bess's loyalty to her husband. Guided by the young medium, everything was soon ready. Candles were placed at regular intervals and lit. Everyone joined hands over the table, forming a circle. The silence grew stifling as the seconds passed. The only noise was the cheerful sound of Halloween celebrations from outside. Just like exactly 1 year ago, according to Celtic belief, the gate to the spirit world would open today. Madame Lenore began to tremble. She held Bess's hands tighter. The medium's breathing quickened, and after a while, she began to speak in a deep voice. But this voice was not one of those exaggerated, eerie voices used by mediums. This was a familiar but muffled male voice. Rosabelle. Bess froze. There was a code they had set with Harry years ago, a code known only to those very close to them. If the summoned entity said the code Rosabelle, believe, they would believe him. The first part of the code had already been spoken. Rosabelle, Arthur Ford, who believed Harry had returned, let out a cry of joy. Bess was trembling, but not from fear, but from anger. Was it that easy? Had they just stolen this code known only to a very few people? Harry used to make pronunciation mistakes when he spoke. Therefore, the person saying the code should also reflect this. If Harry's known pronunciation errors were not made, Bess would know that the entity or the seance was fake. The medium's voice continued, this time raspy, and the words strained. Believe. Oh, no, Bess whispered, her heart pounding against her chest. That was not his pronunciation. He wouldn't say believe that way. This is a trick. However, the medium continued as if she hadn't heard Bess's words, her voice now stronger and colder. Ways. Believe. The code was completed correctly. Everyone in the room was in shock and joy. Harry Houdini had managed to escape death. Harry, you said it. You've returned, shouted Arthur Ford, his eyes filled with tears. Give us proof. Show the world. The medium's face was horribly contorted. Her expression reflected the cruel truth revealed when the curtain of an illusion is drawn. The medium's voice ceased to be Harry's voice. It was now a cold, metallic echo. Proof? Take your proof. At that moment, the rusty shackle key on the table suddenly leaped up, flying about a meter into the air. As Bess and the others recoiled in amazement, the key hung suspended in the air, a strange halo of shadow which seemed to absorb the dim candlelight, surrounded the piece of metal. Then, the key dropped back to the table rapidly, but this time, it did not land in front of Bess, but directly into Madame Lenore's palm. The moment the key's metal surface touched the medium's palm, a violent hiss sounded. The medium's face shed its dull expression and was replaced by a look of terrible pain. Madame Lenore screamed in agony as if the heat of the key was burning her. "This is no trick," shouted Samuel Baring. "It's real." The spirit touched her. Bess stared in horror at the key in Madame Lenore's hand. The rusty residue on the key had left a dark, wet stain where it touched the medium's palm. Bess understood that this was not just a trick by the medium. This was a non-human entity that had stolen Harry's code. It must also have been part of the locking mechanism that imprisoned Harry's soul. Bess finally screamed, "Lies! You are not Harry." Harry would never pronounce the word believe that way. "Who are you?" The medium's head, drooping from pain, slowly lifted with a spine-chilling smile. Her eyes burned with a dark, joyless glint that was not her own. The muffled, raspy voice echoed in Bess's ear. "I am the impossibility of escape." The entity leaned towards Bess. "Everything that belongs to him now belongs to me. The meaning of the code, the function of the key, all mine." "No," Bess interrupted. The entity's smile widened. The corners of its mouth nearly reached his cheekbones. "And I have locked Houdini in his own illusion, forever. You, Mrs. Houdini," the entity sneered, "will never open that lock." The medium's body suddenly convulsed and collapsed onto the floor. The rusty key in her hand remained in Madame Lenore's sweaty palm. Bess reached out and took the key back. The metal was cold and lifeless this time. But Bess now knew that key was not an escape key, but a prison key. November 1st, 1927. New York, Houdini Workshop. Bess Houdini went to her husband's secret workshop in New York the day after the séance they held on Halloween. Her face bore the marks of one night of terror more than a year of mourning. In her hand, she held Harry's favorite metal shackle key. The damp residue on the key was like a fresh wound burning Bess's palm. The workshop was the embodiment of Harry's genius. Illusion mechanisms, locking tools, solved handcuffs, and unfinished notes were in every corner. But Bess's eyes were locked onto the structure standing in the very center of the room, like a massive and eerie statue, the original replica of the water torture cell. This was one of the proofs symbolizing Harry's greatest, most dangerous and deadly performance. The cell consisted of a locked glass and steel cabinet filled to the brim with water. Now it was empty, shining only with the cold, tired reflection of the metal. Bess was certain that the undried moisture on the key and Harry's last words spoken at the moment of his death, "This is a lock," were no coincidence. Moreover, the entity they summoned had claimed the lock was impossible to open. The lock must have been hidden in this water cell. Bess approached the cell's solid steel door. She mentally replayed how Harry had escaped from this terrifying prison for years. He always said that the illusion was only in the audience's eye, and the mechanism was entirely physical. The cell's locking mechanism was secured by a series of nuts and bolts applied from the outside. But the escape was always achieved from the inside, with a secret maneuver performed underwater. Bess knelt and looked at the very bottom of the cell. There, secured with a thick steel bolt, was the main escape lock. This lock was the foundation of all Harry's escapes. Houdini had kept the secret of this lock from everyone. Bess took the rusty key out of her inner jacket pocket and brought it close to the escape lock with trembling hands. The key fit perfectly into the slot. This was something Bess expected, as it was one of the spare keys Harry always used. However, when Bess turned the key, she did not hear the expected click. Instead, she heard a deep, wet moan emanating from the metal. It was as if the lock's mechanism had been sealed from the inside rather than locked from the outside. She tried to pull the key out, but the key was stuck in the slot. At that moment, the temperature in the workshop dropped rapidly. Bess's breath appeared as a cloud of vapor in the cold air. Concentrated drops of moisture began to trickle down the glass walls of the cell, even though there was no water inside. The interior of the cell became shrouded in a suffocating darkness, as if it were filling with invisible water. Bess stood before the fogged glass. A shadow moved inside. It was a silhouette in wet and sagging clothes, resembling the costume Harry used in his shows. The silhouette slowly approached the glass wall and pressed its face against the glass. It was not Harry's face. It was a bloated, terror-stricken, unrecognizable, deformed face from drowning. The silhouette's mouth opened, and words that seemed to have been written from the inside appeared on the glass. "This lock is your chains." Bess jumped back in fear, staggering, her eyes fixed on the silhouette's chest. Beneath its wet clothes, there were rusty chains tightly wrapped around itself and a metal cage that looked like a rib cage. This was Harry's famous escape equipment, but now these chains were imprisoning him. The silhouette looked into Bess's eyes. Its gaze was the same as the terror and acceptance Harry had seen in his last moments. It raised its hands and pointed towards Bess's stuck key on the glass. Bess understood what the entity that communicated with her last night meant. Harry's soul was trapped in a plane that did not belong to the living. The key she found under the bed had been used to seal him instead of freeing him. It was as if Houdini was subjected to a cruel punishment for years of surprising and entertaining people locked in one of his own toys. Here, he was both tortured and psychologically abused by being unable to escape the imitation of his own illusion. Bess looked around the workshop. If Harry's soul was locked inside an illusion, then she had to use the escape artist's rule. To destroy an illusion, you must find the mechanism that created it. She began to leaf through Harry's notebooks. She pushed aside thick volumes like The Mechanism of Escape, The Art of Lock-Picking, Secret Locks and Opening Techniques. Finally, she found a small, leather-bound, locked notebook. On it were only the letters I-L, Infinite Lock. She opened the notebook. Inside were drawings of locks, complex diagrams, and notes in Harry's handwriting. Most of the pages were dedicated to Harry's methods of exposing mediums, but right in the middle of the notebook, the handwriting suddenly changed. It became more hurried, more shaky, and almost frantic. Belief, a fragile prison. To open the lock, you must believe, but that is their power, against us. They are locking us. The lock is inside us, emptying the water, the only way, emptying the water. Bess's eyes fixed on the next page. On the page was a drawing of the water cell, but beneath the tank, a symbol was drawn that was not normally there, a watching eye. Below the symbol, a name was written, Crandon, Harry's greatest rival, the famous Boston medium, Margery Crandon. Harry had been determined to prove her fraudulence before his death. This was no coincidence. Harry's curse was the result of his final struggle with Margery. Bess thought that the entity called the impossibility of escape was a protector, a guardian created by Margery's spiritual power. This entity had used Harry's own skepticism and logic to lock him within his own illusion. Bess stood up in the workshop, trembling with anger. The medium had pursued her husband, not allowing his dead body to rest in peace. She had two goals to free Harry's soul. First, to find Margery, who had created this spiritual curse, and finish her work. Second, to solve the secret of those last words written in the notebook, emptying the water. Bess quickly closed her husband's notebook. The command, emptying the water, and the name Margery Crandon echoed in her mind, but Bess always trusted and remained loyal to Harry's methods. She would follow her husband's commands before pursuing the medium. First, solve the lock. Houdini's most trusted escape key, which he never parted with, was stuck in the lock at the bottom of the water tank. The key was sealed in the plane where Harry's soul was trapped. Bess knew that this key was the physical representation of her husband's genius turned into a trap, and she would do everything in her power to break this trap. Bess tried to free the stuck key with an iron crowbar she took from the workshop. She applied pressure to the thick steel frame around the lock. Screech! The metal groaned helplessly, but the key did not budge. On the contrary, the invisible water inside the cell intensified on the glass, sharpening the shadow of the drowned silhouette inside. Bess picked up one of her husband's notebooks and flipped to the section on locking mechanisms. Harry never liked to force locks open. He understood the lock's logic. Bess tried to achieve the mental clarity Harry used when solving complex escape tricks. On one page, she found a note written in Harry's own handwriting in bold letters. The lock is always the exact opposite of the escape. The more complex a lock is, the simpler the opening mechanism. But the simpler a lock appears, the more complex and counterintuitive the opening mechanism must be. Bess looked at the stuck key. It was Harry's simplest spare key, and now it was stuck in the most complex lock. Counterintuitive, Bess whispered. The exact opposite of escape. If this lock was designed to keep Harry in, then what was needed to open it must be what was normally needed to lock it. Bess took a thin wire in her hand, one of Harry's favorite lock-picking tools. She carefully inserted the wire into the slot around the key. To open a normal escape lock, she would have to lift the pins inside the cylinder and allow the key to be released. But this was the exact opposite of escape. Instead of lifting the pins, Bess began to push them down. She firmly seated each pin in its place. When she touched the first pin, the silhouette inside the glass cell trembled, as if in pain. Sounds of drowning were heard from the silhouette's mouth. When she pushed the second pin, the stuck key suddenly became ice cold. The cold air in the room intensified. Although Bess's body shivered from the cold, she was almost certain she was on the right track. She continued without even thinking of stopping. When she pushed the third pin, she finally heard the click sound. The lock was open. The key was free. Bess trembled as she pulled the rusty key from its slot. The tip of the key was shiny and new, as if washed with acid. But Bess's fingers were numb from the cold. Solving the lock might have broken a part of the curse. However, Bess noticed something terrifying in the process. After the key was freed, a thin, silky, brown hair strand remained in the part of the lock that went into the main slot. Bess took the strand with tweezers and examined it. The hair strand was damp and smelled of brown residue. This was not Harry's color. Harry's hair had turned white early. Bess immediately focused on the only name that came to mind, Harry's greatest rival, whose name was mentioned in his notebook. Bess opened the infinite lock notebook and began to read the notes next to Margery Crandon's name. Harry had tried to expose the tricks Margery used one by one when communicating with spirits in her seances. According to Harry's notes, Margery's mediumistic power was actually nothing more than her husband's tricks. An ectoplasm trick. The medium would appear to emit a spiritual substance called ectoplasm from her mouth or body. but Harry thought this was a silky substance created with a special mixture: starch, egg white, and chemical substances. However, Harry's last notes seemed to have been written after finding this strand and pointed to a completely different truth. If that substance is not ectoplasm, if it is truly a piece taken from a living being, then the curse is physical. This is not a medium's trick. This is a death spell. Bess looked at the brown hair strand in her hand. Harry's last words at the moment of his death, "This is a lock," now gained a new meaning. On the last page of Harry's notebook, an address and a date were written: Margery Crandon House, Boston. Bess stood up with determination, with the silky hair strand she found and the terrifying information she had just learned. To break the chains that imprisoned Harry's soul, she had to find the medium who used the death spell. There was no time to delay. Summer 1928, New York Houdini Workshop. Bess Houdini dedicated months to deciphering her husband's notebook. In her hand, she had the escape key and the silky brown hair strand she believed belonged to Margery Crandon. Bess was trying to understand the last desperate clue in Harry's complex mind: emptying the water. She still hadn't solved the meaning of this phrase. It was clear that it was neither a chemical formula nor a physical instruction. Bess had stacked Harry's rare occult and mythology books next to the notebook. Through weeks of sleepless nights, she examined everything from Celtic rituals to ancient Egyptian funeral rites. Finally, she found the answer she was looking for in one of Harry's extensive researches on occultism. Harry's notes were about the Samhain rituals, the origin of the Celtic Halloween. Harry detailed the belief in trapping spirits through water and mirrors in these rituals. On one page, Harry's handwriting was quite clear. If the spirit is locked in water, it will not be freed unless the water of the prison is emptied. Emptying the water means cutting off all the spirit's memories and energy in that place. This is a magical retrieval ritual, not destruction, but purification. Bess read on. Harry had written that all the objects in the space where the spirit was locked should be burned with the fire of skepticism. This action would invalidate medium Margery's spell of belief and cut the bonds of the imprisoned spirit from that place. Harry knew that the medium's power was built on belief, so the only way to be freed was to destroy the source of Margery's magical power, which was belief. Bess thought of that place with dread. Margery Crandon's house. That house, the source of the curse, must have been the physical counterpart of the plane where Harry's soul was locked. Bess knew that the most effective way to reach the spirit plane was on Halloween night. At least, that's what Harry's research note said. The doors only open on a single night of the year, Harry had said. The veil between the living and the dead thins that night. Therefore, Bess had to be patient. For months, every day, every night, she waited for that moment. She had to prepare her mind, body, and heart until the time came. And now that day had arrived. It was time for the confrontation. Bess was ready to face the medium. She would free Harry's soul from the realm where it was locked and set him free. Boston, Margery Crandon's house. Bess was in front of the gloomy Victorian house in Boston, exactly on the night Halloween began. The house was illuminated with torches. Apparently, Margery was holding a séance again. Bess had taken only 3 things with her: the escape key, Houdini's locked notebook, and a small bottle containing a flammable liquid prepared with a special chemical mixture which her husband used in his stage tricks. Bess slipped silently into the house's backyard, hidden under the cloak of night. The moon shed a pale light through the clouds, and the dewdrops on the grass sparkled. Holding her breath, she bent down under the window. A dim light seeped from the room inside. The thick curtains were half drawn. As she approached the window, she clearly saw the scene inside. Margery was sitting at the round table in the middle of the living room. Around her was a group of people, with faces showing both curiosity and fear. All of them had joined hands over the table, forming a circle. The room was almost completely silent. Only the slight creaking from the wooden floor in the flickering candlelight was heard. Suddenly, Margery's voice, as if coming from another realm, filled the room. "Master Spirit, are you among us? We send you light." Her voice was shaky but firm. Her eyelids were half closed and her lips moved faintly. The glasses on the table seemed to vibrate slightly. One of the spectators took a muffled breath. Bess's heart began to pound rapidly. She watched what was happening without taking her eyes off them, holding her breath, because she knew that Margery was playing the same game she played 2 years ago. She was claiming to summon Harry's spirit, strengthening her own power by mentioning his name. But Bess knew the truth behind that voice, that miracle, better than anyone. Bess approached the lock on the back door. With the most basic techniques she had learned from Harry, she opened the door lock in seconds. She quietly entered the house. Instead of going into the seance room, she headed towards Margery's study. According to Harry's notes, the true source of a medium's power was their personal sacred space where they gathered and focused spiritual energy. When she entered the room, Bess felt a wave of freezing energy. In the middle of the room, there was a brass table and an old, rusty shackle similar to the one Harry used. Around the table were spiritual objects Margery used in seances, crystal balls, and pieces of cloth emitting a silky, wet residue, resembling the ectoplasm substance her husband had scribbled about. Bess realized that the hair strand in her hand was made of the same substance as this residue. Bess took out the flammable liquid in her hand and quickly poured it over all the objects on the table. Then she opened Harry's notebook, the infinite lock, and placed the rusty shackle key right in the middle, on the page where Margery's name was mentioned. "Harry's last escape," Bess whispered. "The lock will be its own key." Bess lit a match. The flame of the match illuminated the darkness of the room for a moment. Just as she was about to touch the match to the table, the room suddenly shook. The door opened. In front of her stood a young assistant with dull eyes and a mad expression, not Margery. A muffled, metallic echo, just like the one Madame Lenore spoke with that night, emanated from the assistant's mouth. "You're late, Mrs. Houdini. You cannot empty the water. The lock is sealed forever." This was the person who had spoken to her in the seance last year. It was the entity that was the foundation of the death spell. As the assistant lunged toward Bess, the match in Bess's hand remained in the air. Bess saw the possessed body of the assistant coming towards her. The young man's face was strained with the entity's cold hatred. His eyes were pitch black, and his breath smelled of suffocating moss. Bess had no defense other than the bottle of flammable liquid and the match in her hand. But Bess was Harry Houdini's wife. She was the confidant of a man who dedicated his life to the power of logic, mechanics, and illusion. "You are just an imitation," Bess shouted, her voice shaky but firm. "Harry always solved the trick." The possessed body of the assistant reached out like a claw and began to move to grasp Bess's throat. In Bess's mind, An escape trick Harry had once taught her came to life. The secret strap and throw. This was a simple but effective trick used to suddenly distract in a crowd. Harry would always use this trick when there was a danger of being caught in a crowd. Bess threw herself to the floor with her last ounce of strength. The assistant's hand grazed Bess's shoulder and hit the objects on the table. Taking advantage of that momentary chaos, Bess, with the agility she learned from her husband, pulled out a small, thin cloth strap filled with explosive powders from the secret stitching of her jacket. Harry would use this to create smoke or sound effects in his shows. Bess threw the strap at the assistant's back and simultaneously struck the match with all her strength. Whoosh! The small strap, the moment it hit the assistant's back, exploded with a sharp smoke and noise. The explosion engulfed Margery's study in a dense, pungent cloud of smoke. This created a physical effect shocking even for a spiritual entity. The assistant doubled over from the noise and smell. Bess used the momentary advantage she gained. She quickly got up from where she fell and ran towards the table. The object soaked with the flammable liquid in the bottle, fake ectoplasm cloth, rusty shackle, etc. And Harry's notebook made contact with the small flame from the match. VOOM! The fire instantly rose, creating a bright, furious pillar of flame in the middle of the room. This was not just the burning of wood or cloth. This was the burning of Margery's belief energy and the connection to the plane imprisoning Harry's soul. As soon as the fire started, a terrifying scream was heard from the other room of the house. This was Margery Crandon's scream. The medium, realizing her power source had been destroyed, made the whole house resonate with fury. When the fire reached Harry's notebook, the shackle key in Bess's hand began to shake violently. The metal surface of the key shone with a bright, blue light, as if the energy inside was being released. At that moment, the assistant, controlled by the entity coming from Margery's seance room, made one last move towards Bess through the smoke. As Bess moved around the burning table, she looked at the assistant's face. The assistant's eyes were no longer pitch black. They were replaced by a pure fear and astonishment. The entity was abandoning his body. Escape. He escaped, the assistant whispered in his own voice, but he is still locked. Bess quickly jumped over the burning table. The assistant's last word wrenched Bess's heart. The curse was not completely over. Harry's soul was freed from the plane prison, but perhaps the traces of captivity still remained on him. Bess darted out the back door of the house. The cold night air hit her face. The smell of smoke filling her lungs stung her nose. Behind her, the flames rising from Margery's house devoured the darkness, reaching into the sky like an orange whip. The windows exploded one by one, and the screams coming from inside mingled with the wind's howl. Margery's high-pitched voice momentarily drowned everything out, then suddenly fell silent. Bess paused for a moment, looking over her shoulder. Her heart was racing, her hands trembling. Everything was over. The final act of her 2-year plan had closed in the flames. Now she just needed to get away. She ran down the narrow path next to the house, disappearing into the darkness by the lake. With every step, she moved a little further from the shadows of the past. With the first light of dawn, Bess found herself at the Boston train station. Her jacket was covered in soot and ash. Her hair smelled of smoke. But the expression on her face had changed. That determination that had been missing for years had returned. She was tired, more than she had ever been. But within this fatigue, there was a strange peace, as if a long chain had finally been broken. She boarded the first train to New York. As she looked out the wagon window, the city slowly fell behind, and the morning fog swallowed the horizon. She saw her reflection in the smoky glass, a pale, exhausted, but free face. Clutched between her fingers was the shining escape key she had miraculously rescued from the fire in Margery's house. She turned it in her palms. The coldness of the metal reminded her of the weight of the past. The key was the same as the final escape tool Harry once used on stage. Perhaps a memory, perhaps a sign. Bess was not sure. The only thing she knew was that she was no longer involved with spirits, fake miracles, or deceived hopes. As the train slowly moved, Bess closed her eyes. The only fire that continued to burn within her was the one brought by determination. When she returned home in New York, the city was already plunged into night. The rain had just stopped, and a thin layer of mist remained on the sidewalks. Bess quietly opened the door, tightly clutching the key in her palm. As soon as she entered, the familiar silence that enveloped the house greeted her. It was as if time had stopped since Harry's death. Without even taking off her shoes, she headed straight upstairs to Harry's workshop. When she pushed the door open, the smell of old metal, the faint traces of beeswax, and a slight dampness came from inside. Right in the center, where the heart of the room could be considered, stood the famous water tank. It was cold, wet, and silent. The fog on the glass surface had already cleared, and that dark silhouette inside had completely vanished. This cell, which once symbolized the boundary between life and death, was now merely an empty shell. Bess took the key from her pocket with trembling hands. That shining piece of metal she had rescued from the flames glittered for a moment in the candlelight. She knelt down, found the small lock at the bottom of the water tank. The key settled into place with a light click. Bess took a deep breath and turned the key. Click! The sound filled the room. It was as if a door that had been closed for years had been opened, and an invisible breath had been set free. Bess stepped back and looked at the lock. Her heart was pounding loudly. Harry's soul was now free. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Bess slowly stood up and sat in Harry's favorite chair. She placed her hands on her knees, closing her eyes. Her breathing gradually evened out. A peace she hadn't felt in years blossomed inside her. Just then, a sound rose from inside the empty cell in the middle of the room. At first, it was so faint it was almost inaudible. It was like a breath or a vibration. Then that whisper turned into a thin melody. Bess lifted her head. Rosabelle. Believe. The words were broken. There was a faint echo in between. But Bess had no difficulty recognizing that voice. That slight emphasis in the pronunciation, that soft intonation. It could belong to no one else. Harry's voice was alive, real, and full of love, just as she remembered it. Tears streamed down Bess's eyes. In that moment, some of the weight she had carried for years lifted from her heart. Before the whisper completely faded, she too responded silently through her lips. "Harry!" Bess whispered excitedly. "You're back. You did it." The whisper continued, clearer this time, but still sorrowful. "Believe. But not everything, Bess." And then, a flower petal dropped onto the armrest of the chair Bess was sitting in. Bess picked up the petal. It was a red and velvety rose petal. This was the signature flower Harry always threw to Bess at the end of his shows. Bess smiled. Harry had returned, but he was bodiless. As a result of the combination of Margery's curse and his own skepticism. He had lost the power to return to the physical world. Harry Houdini had made his final escape. He had broken the curse with the power of illusion, but had forever lost his bodily existence, becoming a ghost. He was now a bodiless illusionist. Bess held the key in her hand. Harry's soul was now free. For the rest of her life, she would fulfill her husband's last wish. She decided to hold a séance every Halloween. But this séance would not be to expose other mediums, but to be her own special, sacred moment to feel her husband's presence.